Picture this: a world of grand palaces, bustling trade routes, and thriving cities where bronze weapons gleamed under the sun and scribes recorded the deeds of kings. These were the great civilizations of the late Bronze Age, standing tall like unshakable pillars of human achievement. Yet, in what feels like the blink of an eye, they were gone. Not over centuries, not through slow decline, but in a matter of decades, entire kingdoms crumbled into dust. The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, even the mighty Egyptians, all faced a collapse so sudden, so complete, that it left behind only ruins and questions. This wasn't just the end of an era. It was a vanishing act on a scale history had never seen before. What could possibly bring down societies that had stood for centuries? Was it marauding invaders sweeping in like a storm? Or did the earth itself turn against them, with droughts and famine tearing apart the fabric of their world? The Bronze Age collapse is a riddle wrapped in mystery, a puzzle where every clue leads to more questions. For years, historians and archaeologists have sifted through the ashes of this forgotten catastrophe, piecing together fragments of pottery, cryptic texts, and skeletal remains, all whispering hints of what went wrong. And what they've uncovered is a story far more complex and far more fascinating than anyone could have imagined. This isn't just a tale of ancient disasters. It's a warning, a mirror held up to our own fragile world. Because if civilizations as powerful as these could fall so quickly, what does that say about us? Today, we're going to retrace their steps, uncovering the secrets of their downfall, from the Sea People's shadowy raids to the droughts that may have starved empires into oblivion. Along the way, you'll see how interconnected these ancient societies were, how one domino's fall could bring down an entire network of kingdoms, and by the end, you might just find yourself wondering, could it happen again? So let's step into the past, where the clues await, and the story of humanity's first great collapse begins to unfold. To grasp the enormity of the Bronze Age collapse, we first need to step back into the dazzling world that preceded it, a time when human civilization wasn't just surviving but thriving in ways that would shape history for millennia. Imagine a web of kingdoms stretching from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea, each one a vibrant hub of innovation. The Egyptians built towering pyramids and penned wisdom on papyrus. The Hittites forged ironclad treaties and chariots that dominated battlefields. Mycenaean Greece erected sprawling palaces adorned with gold, while Mesopotamia's ziggurats scraped the skies. This was an age of firsts, the first international diplomacy, the first complex economies, even the first recorded complaints about late deliveries, etched onto clay tablets by frustrated merchants. But what truly bound these civilizations together was bronze. This alloy of copper and tin wasn't just a metal, it was the lifeblood of empires. From plows that fed cities to swords that defended them, bronze tools and weapons were the backbone of progress. Yet here's the catch: copper might be found in Cyprus or the Sinai, but tin was rarer, often sourced from as far away as Afghanistan or Britain. That meant kingdoms didn't just trade goods, they depended on one another for survival. A disruption in the supply chain wasn't just an inconvenience, it could cripple entire societies, and that dependence ran deep. Take the Uluburun shipwreck discovered off the coast of Turkey, a time capsule from this golden age. Its cargo held treasures from 7 different cultures: Egyptian gold, Canaanite glass, Baltic amber. This wasn't just a merchant vessel, it was proof of a world knit together by trade, where a single ship could carry the wealth of continents. But such interconnectedness came with a price. When disaster struck, whether war, drought, or rebellion, it didn't stay contained. Like dominoes, the fall of one kingdom could drag down its neighbors, unraveling the delicate web that held the Bronze Age together. Beneath the glittering surface, cracks were already forming. Palaces hoarded grain in vast storerooms, a sign of centralized power, but also a system vulnerable to famine if harvests failed. Clay tablets from Ugarit revealed desperate pleas for food shipments as crops withered. Others speak of mysterious raiders coming from the sea, their identities lost to time. The very strengths of these civilizations, their complexity, their interdependence may have sown the seeds of their downfall, because when the storm came, there was no backup plan, no way to adapt. The Bronze Age didn't just fade away, it fell suddenly and spectacularly, leaving behind a mystery that echoes across 3,000 years, and the clues to its collapse lie buried in the ruins of its greatest achievements. The first cracks in the Bronze Age world didn't appear overnight. They crept in slowly, like whispers of a coming storm. In the bustling ports of Ugarit, merchants scratched urgent messages onto clay tablets, shipments delayed, prices soaring, debts piling up. One letter from the king himself pleads for grain from Egypt, warning that his people face starvation. Meanwhile, Egyptian records from the same period speak of food riots in the streets, of temples running low on offerings, of soldiers going unpaid. These weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper sickness spreading through the interconnected kingdoms. At the heart of the crisis lay a fragile economic system stretched to its limits. Think of it like a high-wire act, each kingdom balanced precariously on a tightrope of trade dependencies. When copper shipments from Cyprus slowed due to pirate raids, it wasn't just metal that grew scarce. Armorers couldn't forge weapons, farmers lacked tools, and the entire machinery of civilization began to sputter. Even the price of a single ox, recorded in a Hittite tablet, had tripled in a matter of years. Inflation wasn't just an inconvenience, it unraveled the very fabric of trust that held societies together. Workers who once toiled for fair wages now labored under the shadow of hunger, while elites retreated behind palace walls, guarding stockpiles of grain like dragons hoarding gold. Political tensions only made things worse. Clay treaties between the Hittites and Egyptians, once symbols of cooperation, now carried thinly veiled threats. Vassal states that had long paid tribute to powerful kings began questioning why they should send their wealth to distant capitals when their own people suffered. Rebellions flared up like brushfires, forcing empires to divert precious resources from trade protection to internal suppression. And all the while, the scribes kept writing, recording droughts, failed harvests, and strange omens in the sky. One chilling letter from Ugarit's last days captures the despair. "The enemy ships are here, our cities are burned. Can you not see we are perishing?" Yet the most unsettling detail isn't the collapse itself, but how eerily modern it feels. These weren't primitive societies crumbling under their own ignorance. They were sophisticated states grappling with supply chain disruptions, climate instability, and political polarization challenges that sound all too familiar today. The Bronze Age didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because its strengths became vulnerabilities when the world around it shifted. And as we'll soon see, those shifts came from directions no one could have predicted. The Sea Peoples emerged from the shadows of history like figures in a fog, their names etched into temple walls by victorious pharaohs, yet their true story slipping through our fingers like sand. Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu show them in terrifying detail. Horned helmets, round shields, ships bristling with weapons, sweeping in like a tempest to burn cities and topple kingdoms. Ramses III boasts of defeating them in a great naval battle, calling them the foreign countries who made a conspiracy in their islands. But here's the twist: these carvings might be the only clear evidence we have. Beyond these inscriptions, the sea peoples vanish into whispers and speculation, leaving us to wonder, who were they really? One theory paints them as desperate refugees, not ruthless conquerors. Imagine entire communities uprooted by famine or earthquake, fleeing collapsed homelands with no choice but to take to the seas. A clay tablet from Ugarit describes towns abandoned, fields left barren, and ships crammed with starving families. Could the sea peoples have been victims first, pushed to violence only when no sanctuary remained? Some archaeologists point to pottery fragments found in coastal ruin styles linked to Sardinia, Sicily, even mainland Greece, suggesting a patchwork of cultures thrown together by catastrophe. Yet other evidence hints at something more sinister. Hittite texts speak of mercenary bands turning on their employers, burning cities they were paid to defend. Could the sea peoples have been opportunistic warriors, exploiting the chaos of failing empires? A single shipwreck off the coast of Turkey held weapons from a dozen regions, as if its crew had scavenged battlefields across the Mediterranean. And then there's the timing. Their raids didn't start until after the first waves of collapse had already weakened the great kingdoms. Like vultures circling a wounded animal, they may have accelerated the end rather than causing it. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. This wasn't a single group with a single motive, but a chaotic mix of the displaced and the ruthless, united only by desperation. What's chilling is how modern it feels: climate migrants, economic turmoil, mercenaries profiting from instability. The sea peoples didn't just attack empires, they exposed their fragility. When the threads of trade and diplomacy snapped, these shadowy figures rushed into the gaps, proving that even the mightiest civilizations are just one crisis away from unraveling. And as their ships faded back into the mist, they left behind a question that still haunts us. When the world falls apart, who do we become? While warriors clashed and empires burned, another enemy was silently tightening its grip, one that left no carvings on temple walls but carved its mark into the very land itself. Hidden within ancient tree rings and layers of lakebed sediment, scientists have uncovered a chilling truth. The Bronze Age's final centuries were ravaged by a mega drought so severe it reshaped civilizations. Picture the Nile shrinking to a trickle, the Fertile Crescent turning to dust, and storied cities like Ugarit, once fed by thriving farms, left scrambling for scraps. This wasn't just a bad season or even a bad decade. For nearly 200 years, the rains faltered, the earth cracked, and the lifeblood of entire kingdoms evaporated. The evidence is etched into nature's own archives. In Turkey, the gnarled trunks of juniper trees tell a story of relentless dryness, their growth rings narrowing to desperate slivers around 1200 BC. Meanwhile, deep beneath the Dead Sea, drill cores reveal layers of salt, proof that the waters shrank under scorching skies. Even Egypt, shielded by the Nile's rhythms, couldn't escape. Temple inscriptions shift from boasting of bountiful harvests to pleading with gods for deliverance. One stark example, a letter from a Hittite queen to Ramses II, begging for grain because "my land is dying and my people are starving." But drought alone doesn't topple empires. It's how societies buckle under its weight. As crops failed, prices for staples like grain skyrocketed, triggering economic chaos. A single shekel of silver, which once bought 200 liters of barley in Mesopotamia, soon bought barely 40. Workers revolted when their wages bought nothing. Merchants hoarded supplies, sparking riots. And when hunger gnawed at the edges of cities, people did what they've always done: they moved. Archaeologists trace sudden waves of abandoned villages in Greece, their pottery left mid-meal as if families fled overnight. These weren't invaders storming the gates. These were climate refugees, desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at survival. The cruelest irony. The Bronze Age's greatest strength, its interconnected trade networks, became its Achilles heel. When drought struck one region, others might have compensated if they hadn't been equally parched. Ships carrying emergency grain from Egypt found no surpluses to send. Copper mines in Cyprus lay idle as workers starved. Even the elite, safe behind palace walls, watched their stockpiles dwindle. A shattered clay tablet from Hattusa, the Hittite capital, lists rations cut to 1/3 their usual size. The message between the lines is clear: no one was immune. What makes this discovery so haunting is how familiar it feels. Today, we track rising temperatures and vanishing water tables with satellite precision, yet the Bronze Age had no such warning. They only knew the rain stopped, the earth turned against them, and their gods seemed to look away. Their collapse wasn't just a historical event, it's a testament to how fragile even the grandest civilizations become when the climate shifts. And as we piece together their story from tree rings and ruins, we're left with a question that echoes across millennia. When the next great drought comes, will we fare any better? The ground beneath their feet wasn't just unstable, it was treacherous. The same lands that hosted glittering palaces and bustling markets also straddled a network of fault lines, where tectonic plates ground against one another like restless giants. Archaeologists sifting through the ruins of Troy have found walls knocked askew, foundations split down the middle, and entire streets swallowed by fissures, all telltale signs of earthquakes striking at the worst possible moment. Mycenae's mighty cyclopean walls, built to withstand sieges, show cracks radiating outward as if punched by some colossal fist. These weren't isolated incidents. From Crete to Anatolia, the earth itself seemed to revolt, delivering blow after blow to societies already teetering on the edge. Consider the sheer scale of disruption. A single quake could snap vital trade routes like twigs. Imagine a merchant caravan setting out from Hattusa, laden with tin ingots, only to find mountain passes buried in landslides. Or a fleet of Egyptian grain ships dashed against newly risen coastal cliffs. Infrastructure painstakingly built over centuries, roads, harbors, aqueducts vanished overnight. But the damage went deeper than bricks and mortar. These disasters struck at the very psyche of Bronze Age peoples. When the ground heaves beneath your feet and temples crumble before your eyes, it's not just buildings that collapse, it's faith. Clay tablets from Ugarit speak of priests interpreting tremors as divine wrath, sparking panic and civil unrest. Yet earthquakes alone didn't destroy these civilizations. Instead, they acted as ruthless amplifiers of existing vulnerabilities. A kingdom might withstand a bad harvest or a pirate raid, but combine those with a shattered port city and a decimated workforce, and recovery becomes impossible. Take the Mycenaeans. Their palaces show evidence of repeated rebuildings, each reconstruction cruder than the last, until finally, the knowledge of fresco painting and fine masonry disappeared entirely. It's as if the cumulative stress of disasters, seismic, climatic, economic, eroded not just their cities but their very capacity to adapt. What's most revealing is how these ancient societies responded, or failed to respond. Unlike modern nations with disaster relief systems, Bronze Age kingdoms lacked contingency plans. When Turin's storerooms collapsed under seismic waves, there were no reserves to feed its people. When trade networks fractured, no alternative routes emerged. This wasn't just physical fragility, it was systemic rigidity. The very grandeur of their palaces and bureaucracy, the hallmarks of their success, left them incapable of pivoting when catastrophe struck. And in that inability to bend, we find perhaps the most sobering lesson of all. Sometimes, it's not the disaster itself that dooms a civilization, but the failure to imagine that everything could change in an instant. The brilliance of the Bronze Age was also its hidden flaw. a web of interdependence so finely woven that a single snapped thread could unravel the entire tapestry. Historian Robert Drews called it systems collapse, and it's a concept that feels eerily modern. Picture a towering Jenga tower, each block representing a vital part of society. Centralized palaces controlling grain stores, artisans dependent on imported tin, armies reliant on foreign horses. For generations, the structure held, even grew taller. But when multiple shocks hit drought, earthquakes, raids, the removal of just a few critical blocks sent everything crashing down. At the heart of this fragility lay over-centralization. Take the Hittite capital of Hattusa, where clay tablets reveal a bureaucracy obsessed with micromanagement. One decree specifies exactly how much bread a worker should receive based on the phase of the moon. Another records the weight of wool allotted to each weaver down to the gram. This level of control worked until it didn't. When drought struck Anatolia, the palace's meticulous records became a ledger of despair, rations slashed, quotas unmet, and no flexibility to adapt. Contrast this with earlier, simpler societies where villages stored their own grain and could weather local shortages. The Bronze Age's greatest innovation, centralized power, left no room for Plan B. Trade networks tell a similar story. A single shipwreck off Uluburun carried Cypriot copper, Mycenaean pottery, and Baltic amber, a proof of a globalized economy millennia before the term existed. But globalization cuts both ways. When piracy disrupted shipping lanes or tin mines failed, the effects rippled across continents. A tablet from Ugarit laments, "There is no bronze left in the land," while Egyptian texts speak of weapons reforged from old scraps. Societies that once thrived on specialization found themselves helpless. Blacksmiths without metal, sailors without ships, scribes without patrons, all left adrift in a world that no longer needed their skills. Perhaps most haunting is how these civilizations failed to recognize their own vulnerability. The Mycenaeans kept building grand palaces even as their pottery grew cruder. The Hittites doubled down on grain taxation as fields turned to dust. Like a driver fixated on the rearview mirror, they kept solving yesterday's problems while tomorrow's disaster barreled toward them. Drew's theory forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What dependencies do we take for granted? How many of our own systems, just-in-time supply chains, digital infrastructure, energy grids, are modern versions of those Bronze Age threads, strong until suddenly they're not? The collapse wasn't just about invaders or droughts. It was about a world that built itself into a corner, then found there was no way out. Consider the last shipment of tin from Afghanistan packed onto donkeys, winding through mountain passes, bound for the smelters of Mesopotamia. Now picture that caravan never arriving. That single break in the chain didn't just inconvenience a few merchants, it sent shockwaves through an entire civilization. The Bronze Age's trade networks weren't just routes for luxury goods. They were the circulatory system of empires, pumping vital resources to every corner of the known world. And when that system failed, the consequences were catastrophic. Take Cyprus, the copper heart of the Mediterranean. For centuries, its mines fed raw material to workshops from Egypt to Mycenae. But as piracy surged and kingdoms turned inward, those shipments slowed to a trickle. A single clay tablet from Hattusa sums up the desperation. Send us whatever copper you can spare, even if it's just a single talent. Without it, blacksmiths couldn't forge plows to feed cities or swords to defend them. The scarcity became self-reinforcing. Fewer ships meant less protection for those still brave enough to sail, which meant even fewer shipments. It was a death spiral disguised as a supply chain crisis. Now zoom out to the bigger picture. Ugarit, a bustling port in modern-day Syria, wasn't just a city, it was a linchpin. Its docks connected Egyptian grain to Anatolian silver, Mycenaean pottery to Babylonian textiles. When fire consumed its warehouses and its ships vanished from the sea lanes, the effects were immediate and far-reaching. Egyptian records speak of linen piling up in warehouses with no buyers, while Hittite soldiers resorted to spears tipped with bone instead of bronze. The collapse of one trading hub didn't just disrupt local markets, it unraveled the entire fabric of international commerce. What made this breakdown so devastating was its irreversibility. In our modern world, if a port shuts down, cargo can be rerouted. But Bronze Age trade depended on generations of trust, specialized knowledge, and infrastructure that couldn't be rebuilt overnight. The sailors who knew the currents of the Aegean, the diplomats who negotiated with distant kings, the scribes who tracked complex tariffs, their skills vanished along with the cities that nurtured them. A Mycenaean merchant might have known exactly where to source tin in better times, but once those connections frayed, that knowledge became useless, the cruelest irony. This network's strength had always been its vulnerability, the same interdependence that allowed Crete to enjoy Afghan lapis lazuli or Babylon to decorate its palaces with Baltic amber meant that no kingdom could stand alone. When the dominoes began to fall, they took everything with them, not just goods, but the very idea of a connected world. And as darkness settled over the Mediterranean, something profound was lost. Not just bronze, but the bold vision of a civilization that once stretched across continents, binding humanity together in ways that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. The grand palaces of the Bronze Age didn't just house kings and treasures, they stored something far more volatile: resentment. In the final days of Mycenae, scribes scratched urgent messages onto clay tablets, not about invading armies, but about missing workers and unpaid laborers. One particularly telling record lists rations withheld from textile workers, followed by a terse note: "They have left." This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the crumbling kingdoms, traces of social unrest emerge like cracks in frescoed walls, hints that the collapse wasn't solely wrought by invaders or earthquakes, but by people pushed past their breaking point. Archaeologists sifting through the ashes of Pylos found something startling: the palace's storerooms had been burned from the inside. The pattern of destruction didn't match an external attack. It suggested a deliberate, systematic revolt. Grain silos were pried open before being torched, as if crowds had looted them first. Nearby, linear B tablets lay shattered, their records of debt and taxation rendered meaningless. These weren't the acts of foreign raiders, they were the desperate strikes of people reclaiming what they believed was theirs, and the elites had seen it coming. A tablet from Knossos warns of unrest among the rowers, while another from Turin's complains of men refusing to deliver the king's share. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was baked into clay, ignored until it was too late. The roots of this anger ran deep. Scientific analysis of skeletal remains tells a grim story. While elites dined on meat and imported wine, commoners survived on dwindling rations of barley and lentils. At Mycenae's lower town, children's bones show signs of stunting and anemia, their growth stunted by malnutrition. Meanwhile, frescoes in the palaces depict feasts with overflowing platters, a stark contrast to the reality outside their walls. This growing inequality wasn't just unfair, it was unsustainable. When drought withered crops and the palaces hoarded what little grain remained, the social contract snapped. What's fascinating is how modern these grievances feel. A Hittite text complains of corrupt officials skimming silver from tax collections, while a letter from Ugarit accuses merchants of price gouging during famines. Sound familiar? The Bronze Age collapse mirrors countless revolutions throughout history, when rulers lose touch with the ruled, when the gap between rich and poor becomes a chasm, the result is rarely peaceful. Some cities may have fallen not to the swords of the sea peoples, but to the torches of their own citizens. Yet the most chilling detail isn't the rebellion itself, but what came after. In the ruins of these palaces, archaeologists find no evidence of new leaders rising from the ashes. The intricate bureaucracy of Linear B script disappears entirely, suggesting not just a change of power, but a complete rejection of the system itself. The people didn't want to reform the palaces, they wanted them gone. And in their smoldering ruins, we're left with a haunting question. When a civilization's own people become its gravediggers, was it really a collapse or something closer to justice? Imagine crafting the finest sword possible only to realize the recipe for its metal no longer exists. That was the paradox of Bronze Age technology. For centuries, artisans perfected the art of bronze, creating weapons sharper than stone and tools more durable than copper. Yet this very mastery became a trap. While their craftsmanship reached dazzling heights, the underlying systems barely evolved. Farmers still relied on wooden plows barely improved from Neolithic times. Armies marched in formations unchanged for generations. Even chariots, the tanks of the ancient world, saw only incremental tweaks. This wasn't just a lack of progress, it was complacency disguised as tradition, leaving entire civilizations defenseless when the world suddenly demanded change. The roots of this stagnation run deep. Bronze itself was a victim of its own success. So superior to earlier materials, it dominated every aspect of life, from fishhooks to temple ornament, creating a kind of technological monoculture. Archaeologists find Bronze Age workshops across the Mediterranean stuffed with nearly identical molds, as if innovation had been standardized out of existence. A Mycenaean sword from 1500 BC looks strikingly similar to one made 300 years later, but the real danger lay in the supply chain. Bronze required two scarce metals, copper and tin. When trade routes faltered, the entire system seized up like an engine without oil. A Hittite text from the Collapse era laments, "We have no more bronze, not even enough to make a single dagger." Their entire military edge evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution was brewing in the hills of Anatolia. Iron. Though cruder and harder to work than bronze, iron had one game-changing advantage. Its ingredients were everywhere. Unlike tin deposits that could be counted on one hand, iron ore littered the landscape. Early iron artifacts from this period show clumsy attempts to replicate bronze designs, as if smiths were still thinking inside the old paradigm. But the potential was there. A dagger found in a Hittite royal tomb, its iron blade pitted but still intact, hints at what was coming. The elites likely dismissed it as a curiosity, not realizing their bronze-drenched world was already obsolete. What's most striking isn't just the failure to innovate, but the active resistance to it. Linear B tablets from Pylos reveal a bureaucracy obsessed with maintaining the status quo, allocating bronze down to the ounce, tracking chariot wheels by serial number, micromanaging every cog in the machine. There's no record of experimentation, no budget for research. When crisis hit, this rigidity proved fatal. Contrast this with the scrappy survivors of the collapse, the so-called Dark Age villages where people jury-rigged tools from scrap metal and repurposed broken pottery. Necessity became the mother of invention, laying the groundwork for the Iron Age's explosive creativity. The lesson here isn't just about ancient metallurgy. It's about how success can blind us to the need for change. The Bronze Age kingdoms weren't toppled because they were primitive, they fell because they were too sophisticated to question their own assumptions. Their palaces stood as monuments to what humanity could achieve and to how quickly those achievements can turn into shackles. And as the last bronze smelters abandoned their furnaces, they unknowingly cleared the stage for a new era, one where adaptability, not abundance, would determine who thrived. Among the ruins of the Bronze Age, one culprit leaves few traces: no shattered weapons, no drought-stricken fields, just bones whispering secrets 3,000 years old. Disease is history's invisible assassin, and in the crowded, malnourished cities of the late Bronze Age, it may have stalked the streets like a shadow. Picture the scene: grain stores dwindling, refugees pouring into walled cities, families packed into cramped quarters with dwindling sanitation. These weren't just centers of trade and culture, they were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. When that spark came, it wouldn't have been invaders scaling the walls, but something far more insidious: a silent killer slipping through the cracks of already crumbling societies. The evidence is subtle but haunting. Mass graves near Hittite settlements show bodies piled hastily, with none of the careful burial rites the culture was known for. At Tel Twaini in Syria, archaeologists uncovered a layer of ash and collapsed buildings, not from warfare, but from abandonment, as if the city's survivors simply fled. Most telling are the skeletal remains, teeth pitted with enamel hypoplasia, a telltale sign of childhood malnutrition, and leg bones stunted by chronic illness. These people weren't just starving, their bodies were fighting and losing battles we can't see in the archaeological record. A single clay tablet from Hattusa cryptically mentions the hand of the god striking down entire households, a phrase often used for epidemics. What diseases might have ravaged these cities? Typhoid fever thrives in contaminated water, a likely scenario as drought concentrated populations around dwindling wells. Bubonic plague, carried by the rats that inevitably followed grain shipments, could have spread through trade routes like wildfire. Even something as mundane as dysentery, exacerbated by malnutrition, could decimate a weakened population. The irony is cruel: the very interconnectedness that made the Bronze Age flourish, the ships and caravans binding empires together, became highways for pathogens. A merchant from Crete carrying spices to Egypt might also have carried death in his bloodstream. The darkest possibility isn't just that disease struck, but how it interacted with every other disaster. Imagine a town already reeling from failed harvests, its people gaunt with hunger. Then tremors topple its walls, leaving survivors huddled in ruins. And then the fever comes. In such conditions, even a mild illness becomes catastrophic. Societies that might have weathered one crisis found themselves pummeled by many, each amplifying the next. A Hittite prayer tablet pleads, "Why have you abandoned us to famine, to earthquake, to pestilence?" The answer, perhaps, is that collapse rarely has a single cause. Sometimes it's the accumulation of blows, visible and invisible, that finally brings a civilization to its knees. What makes this theory so chilling is how it mirrors our own vulnerabilities. Today, we track pathogens with genetic sequencing and global surveillance, yet pandemics still catch us off guard. The Bronze Age had no such tools, only the dawning realization that their gods, their kings, and their bronze swords were powerless against an enemy they couldn't even see. And in the silence of abandoned cities and hastily dug graves, we're left to wonder, did the final breath of the Bronze Age come not with a clash of swords, but with a cough in the dark? The world didn't just go dark, it was reinvented. In the smoldering aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, the grand palaces that once echoed with scribe styluses scratching clay fell silent. Linear B, the intricate script of the Mycenaeans, vanished so completely that it wouldn't be deciphered again for 3,000 years. Cities like Pylos and Knossos weren't merely abandoned. Their very memory seemed erased, their ruins swallowed by weeds until locals spoke of them as cyclopean walls built by giants. Yet in this silence, something remarkable was taking shape. The survivors, farmers, shepherds, displaced artisans stitched together a new world from the fragments of the old, and in doing so, they became the unlikely guardians of a lost age. Consider the humble cooking pot. In the shadow of collapsed palaces, archaeologists find crude, hand-made ceramics replacing the fine wheel-thrown wares of the Bronze Age. These weren't just practical objects, they were acts of defiance. Without centralized workshops, people relearned forgotten skills, firing clay in pit kilns as their Neolithic ancestors had done. Yet look closer, and you'll spot echoes of the past, a spiral motif here. A bull's head handle there, ghosts of Minoan artistry persisting in village craft. This wasn't regression, it was resilience, a quiet insistence that culture could outlast even the mightiest kingdoms. Then there are the stories. Imagine a bard by a fireside, centuries after the fall of Mycenae, singing of Achilles' rage and Hector's bravery. Homer's Iliad, composed in the so-called Greek Dark Age, is littered with Bronze Age relics, boars' tusk helmets, tower shields, chariot warfare details so precise they'd later guide archaeologists to lost tombs. But these weren't history lessons, they were transformations. The Trojan War of legend reshaped real conflicts and migrations, turning chaotic collapse into epic meaning. Agamemnon's palace might lie in ruins, but in the telling, it became grander than ever, a mirror for a society trying to make sense of its own shattered past. The Hittites' fate reveals even deeper layers of cultural survival. Their capital Hattusa burned, their cuneiform tablets buried for millennia, yet in the highlands of Syria, Neo-Hittite city-states kept using Luwian hieroglyphs, their reliefs still depicting storm gods with curled beards and horned helmets. Even the title, Great King, persisted, now claimed by petty rulers whose domains would have fit inside a single Bronze Age provincial town. It's as if the trappings of empire became a kind of heirloom, passed down like a family's one remaining silver cup, polished endlessly to keep its shine. What emerges from the darkness isn't just loss, but the stubbornness of memory. The Phoenicians spared the worst of the collapse, adapted linear A symbols into the world's first alphabet, a democratization of writing that would outlive any palace bureaucracy. In Cyprus, a dialect of Greek survived alongside an odd script called Cypro-Minoan, a linguistic time capsule. And everywhere, oral traditions turned catastrophe into legend, floods, fallen towers, heroes wandering ruined lands. These stories weren't accurate records, but they were something more powerful, a way to carry the past forward, even when its cities lay in ruins. The real lesson of the Dark Age isn't how much was lost, but how much refused to disappear. When the next flowering came, the rise of Athens, the poems of Hesiod, the Olympic Games, it grew from roots that had never truly died. The survivors of collapse didn't just endure, they sifted through the wreckage, keeping what still had meaning, discarding what didn't, and in the process, they laid the foundations for everything that followed. Because sometimes the end of one world is just the beginning of another. Digging through the ashes of Hattusa, archaeologists found something strange, a royal archive buried beneath collapsed walls, its clay tablets deliberately baked by fire into near indestructibility. These weren't random acts of destruction. Someone had tried to preserve knowledge even as their world crumbled. One tablet stands out, a frantic letter from the last Hittite king, pleading for grain shipments that never came. The handwriting grows increasingly shaky, the final lines smudged as if written in haste or despair, then nothing. The next layer of soil holds only shattered pottery and the bones of those who didn't escape the flames. At Turin in Greece, the story is told in layers of rubble and rebirth. The lower city shows signs of meticulous urban planning, drainage systems, wide streets, grand homes. Then comes a thick band of ash and debris, followed by haphazard rebuilding. walls that once stood straight now zigzagged drunkenly, their new builders lacking the engineering knowledge of their predecessors. Most telling are the storage jars. Before the collapse, their uniform stamped with palace seals. Afterward, they're mismatched and crudely patched, as if people were recycling fragments of their own broken world. But archaeology rarely offers clear answers. Take the treasure hoards found across Anatolia, carefully buried caches of gold jewelry and ceremonial weapons. At first glance, they seem like evidence of people hiding wealth from invaders. Yet radiocarbon dating tells a more complex story. Some hoards were buried decades before the collapse, suggesting a slow unraveling rather than a single catastrophic event. Others contain heirlooms centuries old, hinting at families clinging to symbols of stability as everything changed around them. The human remains tell the darkest tales. In a mass grave near Ugarit, skeletons show horrific injuries, skulls crushed by blunt objects, ribs notched with arrowheads. But what's chilling isn't the violence, it's the demographics. These aren't young warriors, but grandmothers and toddlers slaughtered together. Contrast this with the warrior graves of Mycenae, where elite burials suddenly stop around 1200 BC. The silence speaks volumes. No more ornate daggers, no gold death masks, just simple pit graves containing malnourished farmers, their bones etched with the telltale lines of chronic hunger. Perhaps the most poignant clues come from the mundane. At a small Cypriot village called Kalavassos, excavators found a single intact room amid the ruins. On its floor lay a loom, its weight still threaded as if the weaver had stepped away mid-stitch. Beside it, a child's toy, a clay horse with wheels. This wasn't conquest or catastrophe. This was abandonment, a moment frozen in time when ordinary life simply stopped. The artifacts whisper questions we can't fully answer. Did they flee? Did they starve? Or did they just walk away, leaving their stories half-finished in the dust? The gaps in the record are as revealing as the finds themselves. In Egypt, the lack of destruction layers suggests the Nile's floods provided some buffer against collapse. Yet even here, royal inscriptions shift from boasting of foreign conquests to desperate pleas for divine intervention. A stela from the reign of Ramses III shows bound sea peoples captives, but the prisoners wear rags instead of armor, their faces gaunt. Victories, perhaps, but over enemies already broken by some unseen calamity. Every shovel of dirt turns up contradictions. At Tel Tayanat in Syria, a once great city was rebuilt atop its own ruins within a generation, its new inhabitants using salvaged stones bearing the names of forgotten kings. Meanwhile, in Crete, the great palace of Knossos shows no signs of violent end, just gradual emptying, room by room, until only the wind moved through its corridors. The Bronze Age didn't collapse, it fragmented, its pieces scattering like dropped pottery, some shattering on impact, others rolling away to become part of new patterns. What emerges isn't a single narrative, but a mosaic of survival and failure. The real mystery isn't why these civilizations fell, it's how some threads endured while others snapped. A Hittite refugee might have carried their gods to a new land. A Mycenaean potter could have taught their craft to Iron Age villagers. The past never truly disappears, it just changes shape, waiting for us to piece together its meaning from the fragments left behind. The Trojan War looms large in our imagination, Helen's face launching 1,000 ships, the wooden horse, Achilles' legendary rage. It's tempting to pin the Bronze Age collapse on this epic conflict, as if the fall of Troy triggered a domino effect across the Mediterranean. But history rarely bends to the tidy arcs of myth. While the war's traditional dates, around 1200 BCE, overlap with the collapse, archaeology tells a more nuanced story. Troy wasn't a singular superpower toppling the ancient world. It was one node in a vast, faltering network. the real lesson lies not in the war's drama, but in how later generations reshaped its memory to make sense of incomprehensible chaos. Excavations at Hisarlik, the site believed to be ancient Troy, reveal a city that was indeed destroyed by fire not once but multiple times. The layer corresponding to the legendary war shows collapsed walls and arrowheads embedded in streets. Yet this Troy was no imperial capital, but a modest trading hub controlling access to the Black Sea. Its wealth came from taxing ships, not commanding armies. The Trojan War may have been just one of many regional clashes over dwindling resources, a footnote in the collapse, magnified later by poets into a world-shaking event. What's fascinating is how Greek Dark Age communities, struggling to survive in the collapse's aftermath, transformed this localized conflict into a founding myth. By Homer's time, centuries later, the war had become a symbol of lost grandeur, a way to explain why Mycenae's palaces lay in ruins. The Iliad's catalogue of ships listing long-abandoned cities reads like a memorial to a vanished world. This wasn't history, it was collective memory distilled into epic, where gods and heroes stood in for complex social collapses. The disconnect between myth and reality becomes stark when comparing Troy to other sites. While it burned, so did Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mycenae, cities far more critical to the Bronze Age order. Unlike Troy, their ruins hold no tales of romantic abductions or divine interventions, just broken tablets recording grain shortages and desperate pleas for help. The Trojan War endures in legend precisely because it offered a satisfying narrative, clear villains, noble motives, a decisive ending. The real collapse had none of these, just slow-motion disintegration, where no single battle could be blamed. This isn't to say the war played no role. If it happened as described, it would have strained already fragile systems. The Mycenaeans, if they besieged Troy for a decade, as Homer claims, might have diverted resources from crumbling homelands. But the collapse wasn't caused by war, it enabled it. Weakened by drought, earthquakes, and rebellion, kingdoms turned on each other like starving wolves. Troy's fall wasn't the spark, it was one flame in a firestorm. The persistence of this myth reveals something profound about how humans process catastrophe. Faced with the incomprehensible scale of collapse, our ancestors crafted a story where individual choices, Paris stealing Helen, Agamemnon's pride, could explain systemic failure. It's a pattern we still follow today, simplifying complex crises into villain and hero narratives. The truth is messier and far more unsettling. Sometimes civilizations don't fall because of one wrong move, but because the ground beneath them was already giving way. And no epic poem, no matter how stirring, can change that. Amid the wreckage of collapsed empires, flickers of resilience refused to be extinguished. While Mycenaean Greece and Hittite Anatolia slid into darkness, the eastern Mediterranean's coastlines became laboratories of reinvention. Take the Phoenicians, their cities of Tyre and Sidon escaped the worst devastation, nestled between mountains and sea like seeds waiting for spring. Unlike the bronze-addicted superpowers, these coastal traders had always lived on the margins, their fortunes tied not to palace stockpiles but to the restless waves. When the old trade networks shattered, they didn't mourn, they adapted. Abandoning bulk shipments of copper ingots, they pivoted to luxury goods, purple dye extracted from sea snails, glass so clear it rivaled crystal, cedar wood fragrant enough to outfit temples from Babylon to Thebes. Their secret wasn't just what they traded, but how. Decentralized networks of merchant families operating like independent cells, each capable of rerouting cargo at the first sign of trouble. Meanwhile, inland along the Tigris River, the Assyrians were rewriting the rules of power. Bronze Age kingdoms had relied on awe-inspiring palaces and rigid hierarchies. The the new Assyrian state built its strength on iron and flexibility. Their smiths, once minor craftsmen, became national treasures as they perfected furnace techniques to mass-produce weapons that didn't depend on vanishing tin supplies. A single iron sword might not gleam like bronze, but when forged by the thousands, they turned farmers into an unstoppable army. Yet Assyria's real innovation was administrative. Instead of micromanaging every village from a distant capital, they installed loyal governors with surprising autonomy. Clay tablets from Nineveh reveal a system where local officials could requisition troops or grain without waiting for royal approval, a stark contrast to the Hittites' moon phase bread rations. The survivors shared an unspoken understanding. The old ways had failed because they couldn't bend. In Cyprus, where copper mines once fed entire empires, villagers began smelting scrap metal alongside fresh ore, creating hybrid alloys that worked in a pinch. Greek refugees settling on Anatolia's coast blended Mycenaean pottery designs with local styles, creating ceramics that archaeologists now call proto-geometric, not quite Bronze Age, not yet Iron Age, but something transitional and alive. Even Egypt, though battered, survived by doing what it had always done, relying on the Nile's predictable floods while its neighbors starved. The river became a thread connecting the old world to the new, its annual gift of silt allowing scribes to keep writing in hieroglyphs long after cuneiform had vanished from Hattus's ruins. What separated those who thrived from those who vanished wasn't strength or wealth, but adaptability. The Phoenicians didn't inherit trade routes. They built new ones by sailing beyond the Mediterranean's known limits, reaching as far as Britain for tin and West Africa for gold. The Assyrians didn't replicate the Hittite Empire. They replaced chariot nobles with standardized infantry armed with identical iron spears. Every successful society in the post-collapse world shared this trait. They let go of what no longer served them. Bronze was beautiful, but iron was abundant. Palaces were impressive, but resilient villages could outlast them. The lesson etched into these centuries wasn't about survival of the fittest, but survival of the most flexible, and in that slow dance of reinvention, the foundations of a new age were laid. Ask 10 historians about the Bronze Age collapse, and you might get 12 different answers. That's the puzzle at the heart of this ancient catastrophe, not a single smoking gun, but a tangled web of possibilities. Some scholars point to the droughts, their evidence etched into tree rings and lake beds. Others argue for the sea peoples, those shadowy raiders immortalized on Egyptian temple walls. Then there are those who blame the systems themselves, the over-centralized palaces that crumbled under their own weight. The truth, it's probably all of the above, and none of them alone. Take the climate camp first. Their case is written in nature's own archives: narrow tree rings in Anatolia, salt layers in the Dead Sea, pollen samples showing olive groves replaced by scrubland. These scientists paint a picture of a world drying up, where a bad harvest wasn't just misfortune but a death sentence. Yet critics push back. Droughts had struck before without toppling empires. Why would this one be different? The answer might lie in timing. When the rains failed this time, they did so against a backdrop of fraying trade networks and simmering unrest. A kingdom can survive a drought if its neighbors send grain. But when everyone's storerooms are empty, crisis becomes catastrophe. Then there are the invasion theorists with the sea peoples as their prime suspects. Egyptian reliefs show these mysterious warriors destroying cities with terrifying efficiency. But here's the catch: those carvings are victory monuments, and victors always have a motive to exaggerate. Recent archaeology suggests a messier story. At some sites, like Ugarit, there's clear evidence of violent destruction. Yet at others, like Mycenae, the palaces seem to have been abandoned rather than sacked. Even the famous Uluburan shipwreck, a time capsule of Bronze Age trade, complicates the narrative. Its cargo held goods from 7 cultures, proving how interconnected this world was. If the sea peoples were mere pirates, why would they sink a ship carrying their own potential wealth? The system's collapse theory offers a different lens. Imagine a game of Jenga where every block represents a vital piece of society: centralized food storage, specialized artisans, long-distance trade. Remove one and the tower wobbles. Remove several and it crashes. This camp highlights the fragility of over-optimization. The Hittites' meticulous rationing systems worked beautifully until the grain ran out. Mycenae's palace workshops produced exquisite pottery until the tin shipment stopped. Complexity, it turns out, can be a vulnerability when the world suddenly demands simplicity. What makes this debate so fascinating is how it evolves with each new discovery. A single shipwreck like Uluburan can upend decades of assumptions, proving trade routes were even more extensive than we thought. Pollen analysis in Cyprus recently revealed an unexpected detail: not just drought, but soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive farming. Even the humble olive pit has a story to tell. Some sites show a shift to hardier crops like millet, a silent testament to changing climates. The real lesson here isn't about choosing sides, but understanding how these forces interacted. Drought might have pushed the sea peoples to migrate, but it was the palace's rigidity that prevented adaptation. Trade collapses could have been survivable if not for earthquakes shattering ports. Like a perfect storm, no single factor was responsible, but their combination proved unstoppable. And that's why this collapse still captivates us today. It's not just an ancient mystery, it's a mirror reflecting our own interconnected, climate-stressed world, asking us the same haunting question: when multiple disasters converge, will we be any more prepared than they were? The echoes of the Bronze Age collapse don't just linger in ancient ruins, they reverberate through our modern world with uncanny urgency. Think about climate change not as a distant threat, but as the drought cycles that withered Bronze Age harvests, only on a planetary scale. Today's rising temperatures and erratic weather patterns mirror the environmental stresses that left Hittite granaries empty and Egyptian farmers desperate. Back then, a regional megadrought could topple kingdoms. Now, melting glaciers and shifting monsoons threaten global supply chains. The difference: we have satellites tracking storms and scientists modeling scenarios, but like the Bronze Age elites who ignored shrinking rivers until it was too late, our window for meaningful action is narrowing. Resource dependency presents another stark parallel. Just as Bronze Age empires relied on tin shipments from Afghanistan, our smartphones and solar panels depend on rare earth metals from politically volatile regions. A single choke point like the Strait of Hormuz for oil or the Taiwan Strait for semiconductors could trigger cascading failures. The Uluburan shipwreck's cargo, with its 7-nation inventory, isn't so different from a modern container ship hauling Chinese electronics, German machinery, and Chilean lithium. Both systems thrive on interconnectedness but crumble when a single link snaps. The lesson: diversification isn't just smart business, it's survival. When the Hittites ran out of bronze, they had no fallback. Our challenge is to build redundancy into every critical supply chain before crisis strikes. Political fragility completes the trifecta. The Bronze Age's rigid hierarchies, palaces hoarding grain while citizens starved, find echoes in today's wealth gaps and institutional distrust. Clay tablets from Ugarit complain of corrupt officials skimming silver, a grievance that could have been ripped from modern headlines. When societies fracture along these lines, recovery becomes nearly impossible. The Mycenaeans didn't just lose their palaces, they lost the collective knowledge to rebuild them, their Linear B script vanishing for millennia. In our era of eroding expertise, where few understand the infrastructure sustaining them, the risk isn't just collapse but amnesia. Yet history's greatest gift isn't doom-laden warnings, it's blueprints for resilience. The survivors of the Bronze Age collapse, from Phoenician traders to Iron Age villagers, thrived by embracing flexibility. They decentralized power, diversified economies, and innovated under pressure. Their solutions weren't about recreating the old world, but reimagining it. That's the takeaway for us. Adaptation isn't just about weathering storms, but learning to sail in new directions. The Bronze Age didn't end because it failed. It ended because it couldn't change. Our task is to prove we can. Among the great powers of the Bronze Age, none fell as dramatically as the Hittites, an empire that once rivaled Egypt. Its chariot armies feared from the Aegean to the Euphrates. At their height, they commanded a network of vassal states stretching across Anatolia, their capital Hattusa boasting towering walls and vast archives of cuneiform tablets. Then, around 1200 BC, it all disintegrated. Unlike gradual declines, the Hittite collapse was startlingly abrupt. One year, their king corresponded with pharaohs as an equal. The next, his capital was a smoldering ruin, its people scattered to the winds. What could bring down such a colossus? The answer lies in a perfect storm of disasters, each feeding into the next with ruthless efficiency. Drought struck first. Tree rings from ancient junipers tell a grim story, year after year of stunted growth during the empire's final decades. Hittite tablets shift from boasting of abundant harvests to desperate pleas. One letter from Queen Pujuhepa to Ramses II reads like a cry from the edge of famine. "There is no grain in our lands. If you do not send ships, we will perish." The Hittites' entire economy depended on Anatolia's fertile plains, but as rains failed, their centralized system became a death trap. Palaces hoarded dwindling supplies while outlying towns starved, fueling unrest. A fragmentary tablet from Hattusa's last days mentions rebels in the countryside, hinting at civil strife as desperation spread. Then came the invaders, not just the mysterious sea peoples, but opportunistic neighbors scenting weakness. The Kaskians, long held at bay by Hittite forts, poured down from the northern mountains. Clay tablets from Ugarit describe enemies from all directions, suggesting coordinated attacks. But the real blow may have come from within. Archaeologists sifting through Hattusa's ruins found evidence the city was torched not by foreign armies, but by its own people. Storage jars were emptied before burning, palace archives deliberately baked to preserve them, acts that speak less of conquest than rebellion. Imagine the scene, a populace pushed past breaking point, turning on the elites who could no longer feed or protect them. The empire's rigid structure magnified every crisis. Hittite kings ruled through a Byzantine bureaucracy, their laws micromanaging everything from bread rations to the price of a donkey. When drought choked supply lines, this system had no flexibility. A tablet from the final years lists rations cut to 1/3 normal levels, while another complains of soldiers deserting because their bellies are empty. Contrast this with the Assyrians to the southeast, who adapted by decentralizing power and embracing iron. The Hittites, wedded to bronze and hierarchy, had no such pivot. Most haunting are the silences. After Hattusa burned, no one rebuilt it. The cuneiform script vanished from Anatolia. Even the Hittites' name disappeared from history until archaeologists deciphered their tablets 3 millennia later. Yet fragments of their culture survived in unexpected places. Luwian hieroglyphs carved by Neo-Hittite petty kings, storm gods worshipped in distant highlands. Their collapse wasn't total extinction, but a shattering, with pieces drifting into new constellations. The Hittites' fate holds a warning about the fragility of complex systems. Their empire didn't fall because it was weak, but because it was strong in ways that no longer matched the world's demands. When drought, invasion, and rebellion converged, their brilliance at administering a stable kingdom became a fatal rigidity. In their ruins, we see the peril of assuming tomorrow will resemble yesterday, and the high cost of failing to adapt when it doesn't. Mycenae's massive lion gate still stands today, its weathered stones guarding empty ruins that once echoed with the clatter of bronze and the voices of scribes recording linear B tablets. This was the heart of a civilization that inspired Homer's epics, a world of gold death masks, cyclopean walls, and warlords who called themselves Wanaks, their authority etched into clay records of olive oil and chariot wheels. Then, around 1200 BC, the palaces burned, not in a single catastrophic invasion, but in waves of destruction that left behind layers of ash and unanswered questions. Unlike the Hittites or Egyptians, Mycenae's collapse left no enemies' boastful inscriptions, no clear-cut villain, just silence. Archaeologists sifting through those ashes find contradictions. At Pylos, storerooms filled with unused jars suggest preparations for siege, yet no weapons litter the floors, no skeletons lie where defenders fell. The fire seems almost ritualistic, as if the palaces were emptied before being torched. Meanwhile, at Mycenae itself, the destruction layer holds something eerie, precious metals carefully stripped away, as if someone methodically looted the site over time rather than in the heat of battle. This wasn't the work of foreign raiders grabbing what they could carry. It hints at insiders dismantling their own world. The climate record adds another layer of mystery. Pollen samples from nearby Lake Lerna show a dramatic shift: olive trees declining, replaced by drought-resistant shrubs. Mycenaean tablets from the final years speak of missing offerings at temples, a euphemism for failed harvests. Yet here's the puzzle: other Bronze Age societies weathered droughts before. Why did this one unravel so completely? The answer may lie in how the Mycenaeans had structured their world. Their palaces weren't just political centers, they were economic engines controlling everything from textile production to bronze distribution. When drought hit, their rigid system had no flexibility. A tablet from Pylos lists women and children sent to work in distant fields, a desperate measure revealing collapsing social order. Then there's the writing. Linear B, used solely for palace accounting, vanishes abruptly. Unlike Egypt's hieroglyphs or Mesopotamia's cuneiform, which evolved over centuries, Mycenae's script disappears as if erased. The implications are profound. This wasn't just a political collapse, but a loss of bureaucracy itself. Without scribes to track rations or artisans to maintain fresco techniques, even basic governance crumbled. Later Greeks would reinvent writing centuries afterward, borrowing symbols from Phoenician traders, proof of how thoroughly the old knowledge had been lost. Perhaps most telling is what emerged from the ruins. In the so-called Greek Dark Age, small villages replaced grand palaces, their pottery cruder but more versatile. Mycenaean motifs, spirals, octopuses persist, but now adorn hand-shaped jars rather than wheel-thrown masterpieces. It's as if the survivors kept fragments of their culture while rejecting the system that had failed them. The Wanaks were gone, replaced by village headmen. Bronze gave way to iron, centralized power yielded to local resilience. Mycenae's end embodies the Bronze Age collapse's central paradox. The very things that made a civilization great, centralization, specialization, grandeur, could become liabilities when the world changed. Its ruins don't tell a simple tale of conquest or catastrophe, but of a society that, when pushed to the brink, fractured along hidden fault lines. And in those fractures, we see the birth pangs of a new Greece, one that would someday give rise to democracy, philosophy, and a world far removed from the silent halls of its forgotten kings. Egypt's survival during the Bronze Age collapse wasn't a triumph, it was a near-death experience. While the Hittites vanished and Mycenae burned, the Nile's rhythm kept Egypt breathing, but just barely. Pharaoh Ramses III's temple at Medinet Habu proclaims a glorious victory over the sea peoples, its walls adorned with bound captives and sinking ships. Yet these carvings are less a record of strength than a desperate performance, a kingdom staging its own resilience while teetering on the edge. Behind the propaganda, Egypt was bleeding. Grain shipments from the Levant, once so routine they were barely noted, dried up entirely. Tomb paintings from this era shift from scenes of abundance to stark depictions of emaciated laborers, their ribs visible beneath stretched skin. Even the gods seemed to falter. Temple offerings dwindled to meager portions of bread and beer, a far cry from the heaping trays of earlier dynasties. What saved Egypt wasn't military might but geography. The Nile's predictable floods provided a lifeline when other rivers ran dry. A single papyrus from the reign of Ramses III reveals the cost of this survival. The people are hungry, the granaries are empty, yet the taxes must be paid. The pharaoh's solution, a forced resettlement program moving starving farmers to still fertile delta lands. It worked barely, but at the price of social cohesion. Strikes by tomb builders at Deir el-Medina, recorded in meticulous detail, expose a society fraying under the strain. One worker's complaint cuts to the core. We have no clothes, no oil, no fish. How can we serve the pharaoh when our children cry for food? The sea people's raids, though repelled, left scars deeper than temple reliefs admit. A cache of letters from the frontier fortress of Zawiat el-Rakam tells a haunting story. Soldiers wrote of watching smoke rise from coastal towns, knowing they lacked the manpower to intervene. One scribbled a plea for reinforcements on a pottery shard, its ink blurred by what might be sweat or tears. Egypt's victory came at a brutal cost, the abandonment of its foreign holdings, a retreat behind natural borders. The empire that had once stretched into Syria now clung to the Nile like a drowning man to driftwood. Most telling is what happened next. The new kingdom, once the zenith of Egyptian power, gave way to a long decline. Later pharaohs recycled monuments, chiseling their names onto statues of greater ancestors. The bureaucracy, once a marvel of efficiency, grew bloated and corrupt. A tax record from the 20th dynasty lists bribes paid to skip grain inspections, a symptom of systems rotting from within. Even art lost its vitality. Tomb paintings became stiff copies of past masterpieces, as if the culture had exhausted its creative will. Egypt's survival offers no comforting lesson about resilience. Instead, it's a cautionary tale of what survival costs. The kingdom outlasted its peers not through brilliance, but because the Nile bought it time to wither slowly rather than collapse abruptly. By the time Libyans and Nubians began chipping away at its edges, Egypt was already a shadow, its grandeur preserved in stone but gone from the world. The pharaohs had weathered the storm, but in doing so, they revealed a bitter truth. Sometimes survival is just the prelude to a longer, quieter fall. Out of the Bronze Age's smoldering ruins emerged a quiet revolution, one that would reshape the world far more profoundly than any invading army. Iron, long dismissed as inferior by bronze-obsessed elites, became the great equalizer of the ancient world. Unlike bronze, which demanded scarce tin and complex trade networks, iron ore littered hillsides from Anatolia to the Balkans. The Hittites had guarded iron smelting techniques like a state secret, but as their empire crumbled, knowledge spread like wildfire. Suddenly, a farmer could forge a plow from local rock instead of waiting for distant copper shipments. A village blacksmith, armed with nothing but a clay furnace and charcoal, could produce weapons that rivaled those of kings. This wasn't just a technological shift, it was a democratization of power, scattering the tools of survival and warfare far beyond palace walls. The political landscape transformed just as radically. Gone were the sprawling, top-heavy empires with their labyrinthine bureaucracies. In their place rose nimble city-states, tight-knit communities where leaders governed by consent as much as force. Athens, Corinth, and Thebes began as clusters of survivors huddling around fortified hills, their governance evolving through trial and error. Unlike Mycenae's Wanaks or Hittite god-kings, these new rulers relied on councils and shared decision-making. A fragmentary law code from early Sparta captures the spirit. Let no man hoard more than his neighbor, lest the people starve while one man feasts. The lesson of collapse had been learned. Centralization bred fragility, while distributed power fostered resilience. Even warfare reinvented itself. Bronze Age chariots, those glamorous symbols of elite dominance, proved useless in broken terrain or against mobs of iron-armed infantry. The new heroes weren't lone aristocrats in gilded armor, but disciplined phalanxes of citizen soldiers, men who fought for their own fields and families. A Greek vase from this transitional period tells the story, painted not with scenes of godlike champions, but rows of identical spearmen advancing shoulder to shoulder. The weapons might have been cruder, but the message was clear. Survival now depended on collective strength, not individual glory. Yet the most profound changes were cultural. The collapse shattered old certainties, leaving room for new ways of thinking. Oral traditions once reserved for palace bards now flourished in village squares, evolving into the epic poems that would become Homer's Iliad. Alphabetic scripts, simpler than cuneiform or hieroglyphs, spread literacy beyond scribble elites. Even religion transformed. Storm gods of the Bronze Age gave way to more personal deities, their myths reflecting the struggles of ordinary people rather than the pageantry of kings. A votive figurine found in an Iron Age hut depicts not a distant thunder god, but a mother cradling a child, her face etched with lines of care and hope. What makes this rebirth so remarkable isn't just the innovations themselves, but the speed of their adoption. Within 2 centuries, iron tools doubled agricultural yields in some regions. Trade routes, once choked by palace monopolies, sprouted organically between enterprising towns. The Phoenicians, masters of this new world, sailed beyond the Mediterranean's known limits, not as imperial envoys but as curious explorers. Their voyages mapped the Atlantic coast of Africa, a feat the Bronze Age's centralized kingdoms had never attempted. Crisis hadn't just forced adaptation, it had unlocked creativity on an unprecedented scale. The takeaway isn't merely technological or political, it's philosophical. The survivors of collapse didn't waste energy mourning lost grandeur. They took the fragments left to them and built something sturdier, more flexible, and in many ways more humane. Their greatest legacy wasn't iron or city-states, but the proof that humanity's greatest leaps forward often come not in times of stability, but in the crucible of catastrophe. As we face our own era of upheaval, their story offers neither reassurance nor doom, just the quiet reminder that endings are also beginnings, and that sometimes the only way forward is through the ashes. For all we've uncovered about the Bronze Age collapse, the lingering mysteries are just as compelling as the facts. Take the Sea Peoples, those enigmatic raiders immortalized in Egyptian carvings. Were they a single, coordinated force, or a loose collection of displaced tribes and opportunistic pirates? The inscriptions at Medinet Habu depict them as a unified threat, yet their weapons and clothing styles vary wildly, suggesting a patchwork of cultures thrown together by desperation. A single shipwreck off the coast of Turkey complicates the picture further. Its cargo held artifacts from Greece, Cyprus, and Sardinia, as if its crew had scavenged half the Mediterranean. This wasn't the neatly organized invasion force of legend, but something far messier, a symptom of collapse rather than its sole cause. Then there's the climate puzzle. Tree rings and sediment cores confirm a megadrought gripped the region, but its footprint remains uneven. In Anatolia, juniper trees show near constant stress during the collapse era, while Egyptian Nile flood records suggest only sporadic shortages. Was this a rolling catastrophe, striking kingdoms at different times with different intensities? A recent study of pollen samples from Cyprus adds another twist. Some coastal cities show signs of abrupt abandonment, while inland villages adapted by switching to drought-resistant crops. The disaster wasn't a single hammer blow, but a wave of crises that societies weathered, or didn't, based on local ingenuity and luck. Emerging technologies are finally offering glimpses through the fog of time. DNA analysis of skeletal remains in Crete reveals an influx of people from the Eurasian steppes around 1200 BCE, possibly refugees fleeing their own collapsing homelands. Isotope testing on teeth from Hittite mass graves tells a grimmer story: children with signs of recurrent famine, their bodies cycling through periods of starvation and recovery. Even underwater archaeology is rewriting the narrative. Advanced sonar mapping has located previously unknown shipwrecks in the Aegean. Their cargoes suggesting trade persisted in fits and starts long after the palaces fell. The most tantalizing gaps aren't just about what happened, but why certain societies vanished without a trace while others transformed. The Hittites' cuneiform script disappeared entirely, yet the Phoenicians adapted their writing into the alphabet we still use today. Mycenae's grand palaces were never rebuilt, but their legends fueled Homer's epics. Every new discovery peels back another layer, revealing not a single catastrophic event, but a slow unraveling, one that feels uncomfortably familiar in our own age of climate shifts and supply chain fragility. What keeps historians digging isn't just the thrill of solving an ancient puzzle, but the humbling realization that our understanding is always provisional. A single clay tablet buried in some forgotten archive could append decades of theories tomorrow. The Bronze Age collapse endures as history's greatest whodunit, not because the answers are lost, but because the questions keep evolving. And in that uncertainty lies an urgent lesson. Civilizations don't fall when they face crises, but when they stop asking how to survive them. The Bronze Age collapse isn't just a subject for dusty textbooks, it's a story that's ignited the modern imagination, fueling everything from blockbuster video games to gripping documentaries. Take the smash hit Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where players navigate a beautifully rendered Mycenaean Greece on the brink of chaos, or Total War, Pharaoh, which pits factions against each other as civilizations crumble. These games thrive on the collapse's inherent drama, the fall of mighty empires, the mystery of the sea peoples, the desperate struggle for survival. But here's the catch: while these adaptations capture the spectacle, they often blur the line between history and fantasy. The sea peoples might be depicted as a unified horde of invaders, when in reality, their identity remains one of archaeology's greatest riddles. Documentaries, too, can't resist the allure of the collapse. The BBC's Ancient Apocalypse frames it as a cautionary tale of climate disaster, while Secrets of the Dead pieces together forensic clues from skeletal remains and shipwrecks. Yet even the most rigorous productions sometimes lean into sensationalism, portraying the collapse as a single, catastrophic event rather than the tangled web of crises it truly was. The truth is messier and far more fascinating. For instance, the infamous burn layers found at sites like Ugarit, long blamed on invaders, might actually reveal internal rebellions or even ritual destructions. Modern storytelling loves clear villains and heroic last stands, but history offers something richer, a symphony of human resilience and systemic failure. What makes the collapse so irresistible to creators isn't just its scale, it's the unanswered questions. Like a detective novel with missing pages, it invites us to fill in the gaps. A video game might cast the player as a Hittite general fending off sea peoples, but archaeology suggests those invaders could have been displaced families turned desperate raiders. A documentary might dramatize Pharaoh Ramses' Roman III victory, yet temple carvings omit the economic ruin that followed. The collapse's ambiguity is its greatest gift to storytellers, allowing them to project our own fears and fascinations onto the past. Are we watching the fall of the Bronze Age or glimpsing a reflection of our own fragile systems? The real magic happens when pop culture drives audiences back to the facts. After playing Assassin's Creed, thousands dive into books about Linear B or Hittite treaties. A fictionalized Netflix series sparks debates about ancient climate change. This feedback loop between imagination and scholarship keeps the Bronze Age alive in ways no academic paper could. But the key is balance, enjoying the drama while remembering that the truth, though less cinematic, holds its own thrills. Because nothing in fiction rivals the quiet horror of a clay tablet from Ugarit, its last words etched in haste, "The enemy is here. Can you not see we are perishing?" A moment frozen in time, no embellishment needed. The secrets of the Bronze Age collapse aren't just buried in the past, they're waiting to be unearthed by the next generation of explorers, armed with tools our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. Imagine diving robots scouring the Mediterranean seabed, their sonar peeling back layers of silt to reveal shipwrecks untouched for millennia. One such expedition recently discovered a trader's vessel off the coast of Israel, its cargo hold still packed with Canaanite jars time capsules that could rewrite our understanding of trade routes in the collapse's final days. Underwater archaeology has barely scratched the surface. Less than 5% of the Mediterranean's ancient coastline has been systematically surveyed. Every undiscovered wreck is a potential Rosetta Stone for this ancient mystery. Meanwhile, climate scientists are turning to techniques straight out of a sci-fi novel. By analyzing stalagmites in Greek caves with laser precision, they can now reconstruct rainfall patterns down to individual seasons, revealing whether, say, the year Mycenae burned was preceded by a particularly brutal dry spell. Tree ring studies have grown so advanced they can pinpoint not just years of drought, but specific months when the rains failed. One groundbreaking project in Cyprus is even using pollen trapped in ancient lakebeds to map how agriculture collapsed field by field, showing which crops failed first and how communities adapted or didn't. These aren't just abstract data points, they're the fingerprints of catastrophe, revealing how climate stress rippled through societies already straining at the seams. The written word, too, is yielding new secrets. Artificial intelligence is cracking Linear B and other ancient scripts in ways human scholars never could. A team at the University of Chicago recently trained an algorithm to spot patterns in Hittite cuneiform, uncovering previously overlooked references to grain shortages and refugee movements. Another project is using machine learning to reconstruct burned tablets from Hattusa, digitally unrolling charred fragments too fragile to touch, the real game changer. AI can cross-reference thousands of texts in seconds, spotting connections that might take a human lifetime to notice. One tantalizing hint: mentions of the dark ships appear in Egyptian, Hittite, and Ugaritic records within the same 5-year window, suggesting coordinated crises we're only beginning to understand. The most exciting breakthroughs may come from the ground itself. Upcoming excavations in Turkey's Taurus Mountains aim to explore a network of fortified outposts that could rewrite the Hittite collapse narrative. Early surveys suggest these remote strongholds held out long after Hattusa fell, perhaps sheltering refugees or even preserving fragments of knowledge. In Cyprus, archaeologists are racing to excavate a sprawling coastal settlement before rising seas claim it forever, a city that appears to have thrived as others collapsed, its garbage pits filled with imported goods from Egypt and Sardinia. Each shovel of dirt could upend decades of theory. What makes this moment so thrilling isn't just the technology, but the questions we're finally poised to answer. Were the Sea Peoples truly the architects of collapse, or just another symptom of a world coming apart? Did some societies survive because they adapted, or simply because they were lucky? The next decade of research won't just fill in gaps in our knowledge. It may force us to rethink everything we thought we knew, because the Bronze Age collapse isn't a static event frozen in history. It's a puzzle that keeps evolving, revealing new layers just when we think we've grasped its shape. And somewhere in those layers lies a warning, not just about the past, but about the fragile webs that hold our own world together. The ruins of the Bronze Age whisper a humbling truth: no civilization, no matter how grand, is immune to collapse. Those towering palaces and glittering trade networks didn't fade quietly into history. They unraveled under the weight of converging disasters. But here's what's truly striking: their downfall wasn't inevitable. It wasn't written in the stars or destined by some cosmic flaw. The collapse happened because a series of challenges, each survivable on its own, piled up faster than these societies could adapt. Droughts parched their fields, earthquakes shattered their cities, and mysterious raiders prowled their coasts. Yet it was the rigid systems, the over-reliance on brittle supply chains, and the failure to imagine a different way forward that ultimately sealed their fate. There's a lesson here that echoes across 3,000 years. The Bronze Age didn't collapse because it was weak. It fell because it was strong in all the wrong ways. The Hittites' meticulous bureaucracy, the Mycenaeans' glittering palaces, Egypt's monumental temples, these were triumphs of human ingenuity. But when the world changed, those triumphs became shackles. The survivors, though, tell a different story. The scrappy Phoenicians, the adaptable Assyrians, the villagers who relearned forgotten crafts, they thrived not by clinging to the past, but by embracing flexibility. They didn't rebuild the old world, they invented a new one. This isn't just ancient history. Look around today: climate shifts stressing global food systems, political tensions fraying alliances, supply chains snapping under pressure. The parallels aren't perfect, but they're close enough to send a shiver down your spine. The real question isn't whether our civilization could collapse, it's whether we'll learn from those who came before us. Will we diversify our resources, decentralize our systems, and invest in resilience? Or will we, like the Hittites, keep rationing grain by the moon phase until it's too late? Yet for all the warnings, there's hope in this story too. The collapse wasn't an ending, it was a reset. The Iron Age that followed brought innovations that democratized power, from village blacksmiths forging their own tools to alphabets spreading literacy beyond elite scribes. Crisis forced creativity, and humanity didn't just survive, it evolved. That's the takeaway that lingers. Collapse isn't about doom, it's about transformation. The choice we face isn't between strength and weakness, but between adaptability and oblivion. So what do you think? Was the Bronze Age's fate a cautionary tale, or a roadmap for reinvention? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to keep this conversation going. And if you enjoyed this journey through one of history's greatest mysteries, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. After all, the stories we uncover, they might just hold the keys to our